Hello, I'm Dr. Sara Knutson. I'm a professor in the Department of History and the chair of the Medieval Studies program at the University of British Columbia. I'm also an archaeologist by training. Welcome to the final of 3 lectures that situate Notre Dame in the wider world at the invitation of Archaeology Now. If you haven't watched our second lecture in the series, you might be wondering why we will be talking about medieval Africa in this lecture series. The main reason is to introduce you to the wider world in which the medieval structure of Notre Dame was built. To put it another way, we will be hearing from the perspectives of people who were, broadly speaking, the contemporaries of the people who built Notre Dame. Medieval Europeans and people from North and West Africa were in fact aware of each other and influenced each other in various ways. In other words, these societies were not isolated from wider global developments during the medieval period. Like today, we have been fundamentally connected in the past as well. So let me give you a flavor of what we will be doing today. To start, I'm taking you to the 1370s on Majorca, an island located off the coast of what is today Spain. In the 14th century, the island belonged to the Crown of Aragon. This is a kingdom that included the region of Catalonia. Now, Majorca's location in the Mediterranean Sea meant that this island was a cosmopolitan place with a rather diverse, multilingual, multi-religious, and multi-ethnic society. A range of material goods also circulated from both near and far. Now, Majorca became an important trading location for African and European traders and a site of bustling activity where Christian, Muslim, and Jewish travelers, navigators, and merchants interacted and practiced their professions. So it should come as no surprise then that the island was also an important site for another profession during the Middle Ages. Cartography. As it happens, it is here in 1375 that one of the most famous maps of the Middle Ages known today was produced. And this map is called the Catalan Atlas. Now, spanning almost 10 feet wide and across 6 parchment leaves, the Catalan Atlas combined cutting-edge techniques in late medieval map making. Note that I'm only showing you the map part, which appears on the final 4 parchment leaves. Now, as a result of these cutting-edge techniques in cartography, for a medieval map, the land masses of Europe, North Africa, and Western Asia are fairly well recognizable here. Now, that's less the case when we follow the map to Southeast and East Asia on the right-hand side. What's also striking about the Catalan Atlas is that this world map was built based on what is called a Portolan chart, characterized by those webs of intersecting lines over land and water that I hope you can see here. These webs of lines are called windrose lines, and they were generated based on nautical observations with a compass. Now, as we zoom back out, we can see that the Catalan Atlas is not a map only about Europe and European political entities and developments. As I've already mentioned, the geography is more accurate in some locations than others. It seems, for instance, that some of the windrose lines traversing Asia are perhaps imaginary rather than accurate representations of navigation. But setting our contemporary standards on accuracy aside for a moment, what we nevertheless see here is a map that is emphasizing the representation of nautical routes, navigation, and travel. The Catalan Atlas reveals a highly interconnected medieval world in which various regions of the world were aware of each other, exchanged material goods and knowledge, and where travelers traversed long distances and interacted with people of different faiths, languages, cultures, and political affiliations. Now, let me briefly show you some examples of the global Middle Ages on this map. So we're going to head first to east of the Black Sea, where the map showcases camel caravans carrying merchandise and heading towards China along the Silk Road. The group of people on horseback here may be depicting the family of Marco Polo. Next, we're going to move to just off the coast of Africa, where the atlas features pearl fishers who are sailing in the Persian Gulf. Now, throughout the Middle Ages and beyond, the pearl industry was an incredibly important vehicle for the trade and exchange of pearls across Afro-Eurasia. Next, the map features people of many faiths, including this representation of Mecca. If you can read that closely, you might be able to see that Medina is also labeled at the top here. Well, in the inscription for Mecca, the caption mentions that in this city, one would find the arch of the Prophet Muhammad, and that people made pilgrimages to the city from, quote, all regions, unquote. So these interconnections, just like the examples I've just shown you, these interconnections are made all the more visible because, like other medieval maps, this map doesn't delineate the boundaries of kingdoms or political entities like we often see in some contemporary maps. That doesn't mean that the Catalan Atlas ignores political entities. Rather, they are labeled in large red and blue letters. But visually here, the routes and interconnections are more immediately emphasized. So this is what the world looked like to the map maker of the Catalan Atlas in 1375. Now the creation of the map, I should say, is credited to a Jewish map maker named Abraham Cresques, who came from either Catalonia or perhaps North Africa. He knew multiple languages, including Hebrew, Arabic, and Catalan. And his knowledge of these languages becomes evident based on the kinds of knowledges that are conveyed throughout the map. Now, if you look closer, and one could, in fact, spend hours examining this map and reading all the detailed inscriptions. But if you look closer, you'll see a variety of historical, legendary, fantastical, and religious figures, each with detailed captions and commentaries that were designed to encompass all the known geographical, historical, and human knowledge. So in other words, as you've already begun to see, this is not just a map outlining geography. You can think of this document as a kind of visual encyclopedia of the world. Now, there's a few more things that I want to note about this map. First, you've already seen some examples of how images of people on the map have been drawn in intricate detail. In addition, those images on the map are oriented in every direction. As we view the map from our current perspective here, you might be able to notice that some figures appear to be facing upside down. This seems to have been done so that the map could be displayed on a table. And it suggests that this map was intended to be viewed from all sides. In other words, this is not a map that was meant to be displayed in a frame on the wall. So many scholars have noted that compared to other medieval maps, the Catalan Atlas stands out for its geographical realism and just the sheer amount of data featured in terms of both geography and what I would call anthropological knowledge based on the inscriptions. Interestingly, Asia is depicted on this map as a complete continent, which was not necessarily true of earlier medieval maps. Now, this all said, maps, whether they are medieval or contemporary, are never entirely unbiased, nor are they neutral representations of the world, and the Catalan Atlas is no exception here. I mentioned earlier that the depicted geography is more accurate, right, in some locations than others. Well, the map is most precise in its drawing of the Mediterranean. The contours of the coastal regions of the Mediterranean, including North Africa, are recognizable to us today. Now, just that observation tells us something about how well traveled and how interconnected the medieval Mediterranean was. And it also situates the map maker in his own context on Majorca. To that point, the territories ruled by the Crown of Aragon are marked in gold. I hope you can see here. If you look at the Mediterranean, look at the islands that are covered in gold and ruby, which, by the way, are colors of the flag of Aragon. And that was perhaps done to impress the map's medieval audiences and to perhaps elevate the importance of Aragonese political and commercial interests in the Mediterranean. So here we see another potential bias. In many medieval maps, places that were considered quote unquote peripheral were depicted in rather, I have to say, dehumanizing ways, right? So featuring, for instance, depictions of cannibals and non-human creatures. Well, we see much less of that kind of thing in the Catalan Atlas, which instead generally represents the rulers in Africa and Asia as human, but more than that, as respected and powerful sovereigns. So I'm showing you four examples of political rulers featured on the Catalan Atlas, including Yanibek Khan, 14th century ruler of the Golden Horde in Central Asia, King Chabek, as his name is inscribed on the map, and who's identified as a king of the ancient Median kingdom, which, by the way, is not medieval. It existed from the 7th to 6th centuries BCE, which means that not all these rulers are contemporaneous with the time of the map's creation. Important to point out. We have Kublai Khan of the Mongol Empire, and I have to say, a particularly whitewashed depiction of the Queen of Sheba, who is positioned in Arabia. My point here is that this map has much to tell us about how the map maker of the Catalan Atlas understood the global medieval world around him and his understandings of geopolitical and social dynamics, right? Both in his own medieval period, as well as extending that to the ancient past. And so as it happens, this information is all incredibly useful to historians and archaeologists. Now, there's one particular political ruler that I have not yet shared, but who may well be one of the most famous sovereigns on this map. I'm not going to introduce him quite yet, but to introduce you to we start discussing this individual and situate this individual in the wider social world of global medieval Africa, we're going to follow the Catalan Atlas to Africa, south of the Atlas Mountains, a mountain chain that's depicted in this map by this tan-colored band that you might be able to see here, which, by the way, could easily be mistaken for a road, but it is in fact representing a mountain chain. Now, remember, this map does not feature North and West Africa as a periphery. Instead, as we will see, this region is really presented as a powerful economic and political center, which it very much was and is. So today we'll hear stories about medieval North and West Africa based on the social worlds that involved two particular materials, and that would be gold and ivory. So let's begin. So to begin talking about gold in medieval Africa, we need to start with the trans-Saharan trade network. Now, contrary to some common misconceptions, the Sahara Desert was not so simply a vast, empty stretch of land. In the medieval period, the Sahara was home to human societies, and it was additionally often described as a region of crossroads, intersections, exchanges, and connections. Travel across the Sahara was time-consuming and not without its own dangers, but it wasn't an unknown or uncommon journey for people to take. So most simply, the trans-Saharan trade refers to the north-south trade across the Sahara Desert. This network often involved large caravans of humans and animals to traverse the Sahara. While many materials circulated and were exchanged in the trans-Saharan trade, there were two main goods in particular that were exchanged and which helped to expand this network. Now, the first material, as we know, is gold. The second one, which is not ivory, is salt. In our contemporary age, in which salt is often excessively used in our modern diet, it's important for us to remember that salt is actually critical for human health. And in the past, it was really necessary to intentionally add salt to the human diet. Salt, therefore, was considered very valuable across medieval Afro-Eurasia. Now, since gold was largely mined in West Africa and salt was frequently sourced in the Sahara, traders could acquire surplus gold south of the Sahara by trading high-quality rock salt. And the high value of salt, as well as gold, is therefore emphasized in Arabic historical sources from this period. Now, over time, the trans-Saharan trade routes came to connect not only North and West Africa, but also they began to support a global economy well beyond the Sahara that was motivated by the economic demand from wider Afro-Eurasian societies for these kinds of resources and materials. Now, the trans-Saharan trade had major impacts on the West and North African societies that were connected by this network. Firstly, the trans-Saharan trade encouraged gold mining. Scholars today estimate that by the 11th century, something of around 9 tons of gold was exported to the Mediterranean and into Europe each year. And that's really an astonishing amount of exported gold for this time period. To put that figure in a little bit of perspective, consider the fact that in the same region, in a much different time period, in the 1930s, which had more modern machinery, much more advanced mining techniques, in the 1930s, this region produced 21 tons. So the fact that medieval societies in the 11th century are producing 9 tons of gold each year is a really astonishing figure. So much of the gold actually went to Egypt, where it was then transported down the Red Sea to India, where it was then used to pay for items like spices and silks. Also, gold is being exchanged into medieval Europe, and West Africa at this point is the major source of gold for medieval Europe. So that's one impact of the trans-Saharan trade. Another one is that the exchange of gold and other materials along this this trade network is also creating a demand for human labor to work in the gold and salt mines. And so, unfortunately, systems of slavery were a part of this historical context. Um, but that's something that we need to unpack more in a different presentation. The trade network also supported the development of major urban centers, since new concentrations of people were stimulating growth in agriculture and in craft industries. In West Africa in particular, if you can locate these cities on the map, the locales of Djenné, Gao, and Timbuktu all emerge as really important cities, and they become important centers in the export-import trade. Another locale called Kumbisala was likely the largest city in West Africa in the 12th century, with a population of around 15 to 20,000 people. While that might not sound like much to us today, that population would have been considered a metropolis by all medieval standards. Consider the fact that the European cities of London or Paris were smaller than Kumbisala at this time. Those European cities only achieved that population size by the late 13th century. Now, while we're talking about the material of gold, I want to highlight some important societies in West Africa that were a fundamental part of those historical developments. Now, for West Africa, the period between 800 to 1500 CE is known as the Age of Great Kingdoms and Empires. So let's take a look at some. Now, to start, approximately around the 4th century CE, the Soninke people established what is today often called the Kingdom of Ghana. Note that the contemporary country of Ghana is not located at the exact same site as the ancient kingdom. The name for the country was selected in the 20th century to signify the rebirth of this illustrious past. Now, when I teach this history to my students in my Global History Before 1500 course, I communicate that one of our goals is to try to understand people in the past as they understood themselves and their world. For this reason, whenever possible, we use terms that people in the past used to refer to themselves and their land. So we're looking for endonyms whenever possible. Well, the Soninke called their ruler Ghana, which means something along the lines of warrior or war chief. By the late 8th century, Muslim traders and other foreign traders applied the ruler's title of Ghana to the region where the Soninke lived, which was south of the Sahara, as you can see on this map. However, the Soninke didn't call their land Ghana, that was for the ruler. They called their land Ouagadougou. Now, only the southern part of Ouagadougou received enough rainfall for agriculture. And so, for this reason, the Soninke developed really sophisticated farming and irrigation systems, which led to abundant crop production. So eventually, Ouagadougou was able to support a population of as many as 200,000 people. Ouagadougou was so remarkable that travelers coming from the Islamic Caliphate, like al-Bakri from in the 11th century, praised the kingdom as a model for other rulers, that other rulers should be emulating the glory of this kingdom. Now, just before the year 1000, Ouagadougou captured an important town on the trans-Saharan caravan route. And after that point, Ouagadougou's rulers were able to eventually expand their kingdom and rule over a territory that was approximately as large as the state of Texas. And at this time, no other power in the region could successfully challenge the Ghana of Ouagadougou. Now, the Ghana held his elaborate court and administration in the large, vibrant city of Kumbisala, as I've already introduced. Well, the Ghana charged customs on goods entering and leaving the kingdom. Salt, as we've already seen, salt was incredibly important and actually was the largest import into Ouagadougou. And foreign merchants also paid a tax to the Ghana on trade goods like cloth, metalwork, weapons, and of course, gold. Now, the Ghana held a monopoly on the gold export. And this means that the gold industry was undeniably the Ghana's largest source of income. So West African societies like the Soninke in Ouagadougou maintained a global reputation for having not only the most abundant supply of gold, but also gold that was reputed to be the best, have the purest quality. And that's something that a Persian writer describes in his 10th century historical account. Now, I showed you this medieval gold bead on a previous slide. The bead was crafted in either Egypt or Syria. Now, as archaeologists, in addition to investigating how an object was crafted, where, and by whom, it's also important for us to trace the different forms that this object has taken, starting with the sourcing of the raw materials that produced the object. So in the case of this object, the gold was likely sourced in medieval West Africa and was exchanged, particularly as in its raw gold material, it was exchanged across the Sahara before being crafted into this intricate bead in Fatimid, Egypt, or Syria. The visual style of this bead also spread globally throughout the medieval period, since we know that Fatimid jewelry shares similar styles and metalworking techniques with Byzantine objects. Well, today, this classic style of bead remains common throughout West Africa. And this is a great example not only of the ways in which physical materials, such as gold, can spread over space and time, but it also is a great example that shows us that intangible, what we call visual culture or artistic styles and objects, these too can spread over space and time as a result of global interactions. Okay, back to Ouagadougou. Eventually, Ouagadougou splits into several smaller kingdoms that start fighting amongst themselves. One people, the Mandinga, gradually assert control over the other kingdoms. It's important to note that the Mandinga had been part of Ouagadougou, and the Mandinga and the Soninke refer or belong rather to the same language group. So, building on the foundations of the former kingdom of Ouagadougou, this new kingdom called Mali developed into an even more organized and powerful state. And the success of Mali resulted really from its, on one hand, its strong agricultural base, but also its commercial interactions. And so, because of these things, Mali is able to support a growing and large population and is able to provide enormous wealth. I should note that the Mandinga were extremely successful at agriculture. And as we know, the kingdom's geographical position means that the kingdom was really, strategically situated at the heart of West African trade networks. Now, during the period of Ouagadougou, the Mandinga were already acting as intermediaries in the gold and salt trade. So by the time we get to the 13th century, Mandinga traders are continuing to become major actors in these global networks. Now, the Kingdom of Mali had two particularly famous rulers. whose military activities also helped to expand the empire. Um, the first of these rulers was an individual named Sunjata, whose name is on the slide, who I would love to discuss more, but for the sake of time, I'm going to actually move to the second ruler that I have in mind, who was a descendant of Sunjata. And so that brings me, as promised, to the ruler that I mentioned when we explored the Catalan Atlas. And that individual is named Mansa Musa. Now, in the Mandinga's language, Mansa means emperor. Now, his influence extended northward to several cities in the Sahara, eastward to the trading cities of Timbuktu and Gao, westward to the Atlantic Ocean. And throughout these territories, Mansa Musa maintained strict control over the trans-Saharan trade. His empire came to be roughly twice the size of Ouagadougou and contained approximately 8 million people. And all of this brought him incredible wealth. Now, adjusted for inflation, which is really difficult to do when we're comparing different historical periods, but Mansa Musa is often regarded as the richest person in history ever, in any time period, including ours. That fact might have just changed this year, but I'm not going to engage in that debate for the time being, nor am I going to uplift contemporary billionaires. The point is, Mansa Musa acquired unimaginable wealth based on gold. And he's also an incredibly important figure for the global Middle Ages. So if we return here to the Catalan Atlas, we see that, or we will see how Mansa Musa represents Africa as a powerful economic center. You can see from this detail of the map that Mansa Musa is depicted seated cross-legged on a cushioned golden throne. He wears a golden crown, and he also carries an orb and scepter, which were the traditional emblems of kings in medieval Europe. Now, like many scholars, I interpret this depiction of Mansa Musa to mean that the mapmaker of the Catalan Atlas considered him to be a respected, formidable sovereign. Not that I'm suggesting that Mansa Musa needs to be depicted with European regal symbols in order to be taken seriously. But Mansa Musa very much built on the foundation of his predecessors. He replicated systems of administration and taxation that we saw in Ouagadougou. He took responsibility for the territories that formed the heart of the Empire of Mali, and he appointed governors to rule the outerlying provinces and dependent kingdoms. He also differed, though, in some ways from his predecessors, including that he became a devout Muslim. While most of the Mandinga people continued to practice their traditional beliefs during his reign, Islamic practices and influences nevertheless did expand in Mali and wider West Africa at this time. And so in the 1324 to 1325, Mansa Musa made a pilgrimage to Mecca. And during the trip, he pays a state visit to the Egyptian Sultan. So Mansa Musa travels to Cairo with an entourage that included hundreds of enslaved individuals who are reported to each have carried a 6-pound staff of gold. The entourage included about 100 elephants, each carrying about 100 pounds of gold. So you can kind of get the picture of what this entourage looked like. So Mansa Musa is very much demonstrating his lavish wealth in the Egyptian capital. One of the Sultan's officials recounted that there was no person in Cairo who did not receive a sum of gold from Mansa Musa during his visit. And according to this account, if we can take it at face value, which historians will tell you never to do. But according to the account, there was so much gold in Cairo that apparently it temporarily deflated the value of money there. So, as a result of Mansa Musa's pilgrimage, societies around the Mediterranean learned firsthand of Mali's wealth and power. And Mali began to be known as one of the world's great empires at this time. And this was a reputation that Mali kept well into the 15th century. Now, Mansa Musa also returned to Mali from his pilgrimage with a distinguished Muslim architect who was commissioned to build new mosques in Timbuktu and other cities in Mali. And so, under Mansa Musa, Timbuktu in particular becomes a thriving trade center, attracting merchants and traders from North Africa and all parts of the Mediterranean world um, who are bringing with them cosmopolitan attitudes and ideas. So in the 15th century, Timbuktu develops into a global center for learning and scholarship. It attracted architects, astronomers, poets, mathematicians, lawyers, theologians, all from across Afro-Eurasia. And interestingly enough, books become the most common item of trade in the city, which I kind of like. And so Timbuktu, its traditions and its reputation for intellectualism and scholarship was something that continued well beyond the medieval period. So to conclude this section on gold, I want to draw your attention to another detailed scene from the Catalan Atlas. On the right, we have Mansa Musa again and the related inscription that describes, quote, "This king is the richest and noblest of all these lands due to the abundance of gold that is extracted from his lands," unquote. Now, approaching Mansa Musa here is an Amazigh emir. You might be more familiar with the cultural term Berber, but again, I prefer to use the indigenous cultural term for this society. And the Imazighen, to use the plural term, were incredibly important figures in the trans-Saharan trade. I am, though, going to save that for a future lecture since Amazigh culture and material culture are an incredibly important part of my research, and I think they should get their own lecture. Finally, on the left, along the western shoreline of West Africa, the Catalan Atlas depicts the approaching ship of a Majorcan captain. And the caption here claims that this captain is seeking to find the so-called River of Gold, dated to 1346. Again, this is according to the caption. So taken as a whole, this particular detail of the Catalan Atlas highlights the kinds of global medieval connections in which North and West Africa had a significant central role. And it speaks to the diverse individuals who were connected and even personally interacted with each other as a result of the gold industry and the exchange of this material. All right, so let's move on now to the second part, which is now about ivory. And this is a material that also has many stories to tell about medieval Africa. We've already seen in this lecture that while the exchange and value of gold and salt launched trans-Saharan caravans, many other materials also come to be exchanged in this trade network as well. A 14th century Arabic text, which in English is called the Book of Geography by Azuhri, lists a number of exports from the region south of the Sahara. And in his list, ivory is actually mentioned twice. Firstly, as whole elephant tusks, and secondly as ivory, not necessarily in its full tusk form. Well, art historian Sara has argued that the exchange of elephant ivory across the Sahara was closely linked to the economic demand for this material in the Mediterranean and in Europe between the 10th to 14th centuries. And indeed, during the European Middle Ages, ivory was one of the most common materials taken from foreign or so-called exotic animals. There was a huge market demand for this material. Ivory was used for carving all kinds of art and materials, from religious items like crucifixes, reliefs, bishop croziers, devotional diptychs, and secular patrons are also equally desiring ivory for the production of mirrors, combs, cosmetic vessels, hair parters, statuettes, and gaming pieces, including chess pieces. Now, European carvers preferred the ivory of the African savanna elephant for its color and soft material. The ivory tusks from the African savanna elephant are also much larger than those coming from, for example, the Asian elephant. So this preference for ivory from the African savanna elephant has an appreciable impact on global medieval trade networks. Consider the fact that during the medieval period, China and India also were importing African ivory from the Swahili coast in order to supplement their own supply of Asian elephant ivory, as Sara points out. We therefore cannot understate the importance of the trans-Saharan network and the diverse African societies involved in those exchanges, which ultimately led to the circulation of African ivory into the Mediterranean and Europe. Now, exactly what those networks looked like has changed over the course of the Middle Ages. In some centuries, the flow of the African savanna ivory into Europe diminished, despite the continued economic demand in Europe for that material. And that prompted the search for and use of alternate sources of ivory. So, for instance, Scandinavians created a new kind of ivory supply network that involved sourcing ivory from walruses in the North Atlantic, including Greenland. You might be familiar with a famous set of medieval ivory chess pieces called the Lewis chessmen, such as this queen shown here. These pieces are carved from walrus ivory, not from elephant ivory. And in recent years, some scholars, myself included, have done a lot of research that reveals a certain relationship between the supply of elephant ivory versus the supply of walrus ivory into Europe. And when the flow of elephant ivory more properly resumed into Europe, the demand for alternative sources like walrus ivory then diminished. Now, while there's much more to say about the Scandinavians' role in the medieval ivory exchange, that is beyond the scope of this presentation, but I mentioned this context here and the archaeological and art historical research behind it, because this example helps demonstrate just how global the medieval period was. The economic and social activity of medieval African societies could and did have global impacts that could be felt by societies in other regions of the world, including in Scandinavia as much as in Southeast and East Asia. So with that, let's return properly then to medieval Africa and look at an example of an ivory object. So here we have an ivory casket that was carved in the 12th century in Sicily. Now, located in the Mediterranean, Sicily is therefore very closely positioned to the trans-Saharan routes of North Africa and West Africa as well. Now, Sicily and southern Italy maintained a close relationship with the region Ifriqiya, um, which today is modern day Tunisia. And that really supported the continued circulation of African ivory into the 11th and 12th century Mediterranean, where this object was then subsequently carved. Now, art historians will tell you that the visual style of this particular object on the slide represents a blend of different cultures who interacted in 12th century Sicily. In particular, I'm referring here to the Normans, who had recently conquered Sicily in this period, as well as to the Arabic-speaking Muslim population of Sicily that had not been entirely displaced by the Normans. So the social interactions between these two groups created a visual style that was unique to Sicily at this time. And this object style is therefore called Siglo-Arabic, in case you want to know. Um, and this object is fashioned, as you can see, from thin slices of elephant ivory, and it's held together. If you look really closely at the image, it's held together by really fine ivory pegs. Um, so you can also hopefully see as you're looking at the image, the ornamental design and the way that it's been applied with gold leaf. This object also contains an inscription in Arabic located on the front rim and cover that reads, "May glory endure," which is an inscription wishing goodwill to the object's owner. Now, those kinds of inscriptions, by the way, are these inscriptions that are wishing, contain wishes of happiness or glory or blessings. These kinds of inscriptions are also incredibly common on Islamic metalwork from this period, but that too is another lecture. Now, medieval containers like this one were often used for secular purposes. They could be used for wedding gifts or used as jewelry boxes. And some of them also come to be used for religious purposes, such as reliquaries. Now, let me show you an earlier example. This is another elephant ivory casket, completed with a silver hinge on both sides. And this one was carved a few centuries before the casket that I just showed you on the previous slide. This cylindrical container was commissioned in Islamic Spain by the Umayyad Caliph Al-Hakam II in 964 CE. And this ivory container, as you can imagine, was carved from the cylinder of an elephant tusk. And you can also see that the surfaces of the container and its lid are really elaborately decorated with these intricate vegetal designs. If you look closely, and you should be able to see all three, but if you look closely at the container, you might be able to spot some animals. And that includes two peacocks that are facing each other. We have instances of gazelles that are depicted closer to the bottom. And then as you move towards the top, you might also see some images of birds. And then as you keep moving to the top, an inscription in Arabic in the Kufic script appears along the lid, once again wishing blessings to its owner. And again, in addition to examining the artistic design and the really intricate craftsmanship of this piece, as archaeologists, we're also interested in this object across various stages of its itinerant history. We cannot forget that this object can tell us something about the kinds of connections and exchanges that brought the raw ivory material all the way from the savanna of East Africa through the trans-Saharan trade and into medieval Islamic Iberia. Okay, at this point, we've examined some stunning pieces of elephant ivory that were carved in the Mediterranean. I also want to show you some examples of stunning carved ivory objects from medieval Africa, because it's important to point out that medieval African societies were heavily involved and influential in these ivory trade networks, and they were also fantastic ivory carvers in their own right. So as an example, this is an ivory bracelet that was carved by a Yoruba artist in the 16th century. Note for a minute that Yoruba refers to both the language as well as an ethnic designation. Their homeland is sometimes known in English as Yorubaland, spanning across the present-day countries of Nigeria, Togo, and Benin. Well, Islam spreads to the Yoruba peoples in the 14th century, and that's later than the spread of Islam in other societies in West Africa. Well, Islam spreads to the Yoruba not least as a result of trade with merchants from the Empire of Mali during the reign of Mansa Musa, who, remember, converted to Islam. So because of this, Islam came to be traditionally known to the Yoruba as the quote-unquote religion of the Malians. And I mention that because this again speaks to the social world of medieval Africa, in which these societies were by no means isolated, right? They maintained local, regional, and global networks. Well, in the medieval period, roughly between 1400 to 1600, Owo was a capital of a Yoruba city-state or kingdom in if you want the term that's at the bottom of the caption. It's in this context that this ivory bracelet was carved. Now, everything about this bracelet speaks to the technical sophistication of the artist. The bracelet is carved from one piece of ivory and fashioned into two interlocking layers. The bracelet is, as you can see, the bracelet also features attached pendants, which kind of function like rattles. And the surface of the outer interlocking piece features human-like figures that reference Yoruba oral traditions, including their creation story that involves a young god named Obatala. There's also interlocking circles of crocodiles featured on the bracelet and depictions of mudfish. Well, the skill of Owo's ivory carvers was well known not only just among the Yoruba, but also to other West African kingdoms, including the Edo. The Edo were located um, in what is today Nigeria. Well, they established a kingdom around 1180 CE that is today often called the Kingdom of Benin. But the name that the Edo give their kingdom was, as I have on the slide for you, Igodomigodo. Well, throughout the late medieval period and beyond, the Edo and the Yoruba shared ivory carving techniques amongst these societies. And they're also sharing an appreciation for ivory-based craftworking and art. And after the medieval period, into the 17th and 18th centuries, the rulers of Igoro um, became increasingly interested in commissioning insignia for their rulers that was made from ivory. So again, we see this continued interest in ivory crafted materials. And at this point, it encourages the Edo to import artistic objects from Owo, as well as to recruit Yoruba artisans for their own royal workshops. So you can see in this context an example of an ivory object that was produced during this period. So the one that I've given you on the slide is an ivory pendant that depicts the Ioba, which is an elite title given to the mother of the ruler, the Oba. All right. So to conclude this presentation, I want us to return to the Catalan Atlas. Now that we've followed some stories of gold and ivory to meet and hear the perspectives of some societies from medieval Africa who created social, cultural, economic, and political connections that again really placed Africa as an undeniable center in the global Middle Ages. These connections didn't always necessarily start in the medieval period. We know that networks of exchange have connected Africa with societies in the Mediterranean and beyond since antiquity. But these exchanges in the medieval period only expanded what these global interactions could look like, made possible not least by the trans-Saharan trade. And these connections were observed and sometimes recorded by foreign traders and travelers, knowledge that not least comes to be incorporated into documents like the Catalan Atlas. But material traces and knowledge of these global connections from Africa are also, it's important to remember, importantly recorded and remembered by the African societies themselves. Their contributions and heritage are also really vital to our understandings of this global past. So with that, I'll start by saying thank you for joining. And for those of you who are coming back, thank you for coming back. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation and have learned something. The knowledge that we have examined today really only scratches the surface of this fascinating period in the past and the vastly diverse and fantastic societies in Africa that made these historical developments possible. There are so many societies and indeed entire regions of Africa that we didn't have time to discuss today. So if you're interested in learning more about the archaeology of gold and ivory in medieval Africa, I can highly recommend this book featured on the slide from Princeton University Press. In the meantime, medieval Africa is a time and place that I really enjoy teaching in my courses at UBC. So if you have any questions or comments, my institutional email is publicly available and shared with you on the slide. You're welcome to drop me a message. Otherwise, feel free to leave a question or comment below. In the meantime, thank you so much again. Thank you for your attention, and I'll see you next time. Thank you, everyone.